There's a border between good and evil. As we cross the threshold, we step towards the deep, dark corridors of the human mind. Our vehicle to darkness is hungry to take us down to the bottom, the basement of the mind, where motives are pinned down before victims are. And we go deeper. Innocence broken. Toys remember what children cannot. Deeper and deeper beneath the earth, where we bury what we can't bear. But nothing stays buried forever. The deeper you go, the less human it gets. It's Halloween night, the kind of night where the autumn chill in the air makes it feel scarier. It's a night full of candy, mischief, and laughter echoing off residential sidewalks. Porch lights glow orange, carved pumpkins flicker like tiny beacons, and in this small Northern California town, everyone seems to be in on the very same secret, that for one night a year, pretending to be something you're not is harmless fun. Parents sip wine from plastic cups at the end of their driveways. Children tumble up the front steps in costumes. Superheroes, tiny witches, princesses, dragging glittering skirts across the pavement. Behind every door is a bowl of sweets and a smile. No one is thinking about danger. Not here, not tonight. Because this place isn't the kind of town you lock your doors. The kind of town where you might leave the porch light on just a little longer, hoping a few straggler trick-or-treaters will wander by. Inside one house, at the end of a small street, 3 young women are doing the same thing everyone else was, answering the door, laughing at costumes, handing out the last of their candy. Later, they grab their bowl of leftover chocolate, put a scary movie on TV, and plan to call it a night once the doorbell finally stops ringing. It's ordinary, it's simple, and perfect, the kind of night that becomes a memory. But somewhere outside, a man is watching. He doesn't need a mask. The darkness does that for him. And what happened inside that house showed this quiet community that the monsters outside on Halloween can make their way inside. And this one wasn't pretending to be evil. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you've never been here before, I am Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. And if you didn't notice, this is a special episode. If you didn't catch that intro, it was inspired by one of you. That's right, because the winner of this year's Halloween series naming contest is Vines. That's the name you put on the entry form, and that is what you go by, so you know who you are. Congratulations for winning. We will be emailing you at the email you left on the entry form, and you will be getting all of your holiday goodies. And I do want to admit I combined their name choice with one change. They chose Steps of the Damned, and I went with Depths of the Damned. So thank you so very much. We will be emailing you soon to get all your details. And thank you all so much for participating this year. I want to take a minute to talk to the ladies. How many of you can relate to PMS getting in the way of life, especially postpartum? Can you relate to everything feeling out of whack, the bloating, the mood swings, the who am I today? Because some days I felt like I was a real life Halloween goblin. And if you didn't know, I'm 43 and I did have a baby last year, and I've been trying to get my hormones back on track ever since. And that is where today's lovely sponsor comes in, Beam Glow Women's Super Powder. Even the name makes me feel good about using it. Women's Super Powder. It sounds like a superpower, and it really has become mine. I already loved Beam Dream for sleep, the taste, the effectiveness. So when I heard about Glow Super Powder from Beam, I had to give it a try. I think of it as my daily inside-out support system for hormones in one step, which I really need because I can't do anything with too many steps. It works to manage PMS symptoms, and it's got magnesium to help ease cramps and mood swings and bloating, vitamin B6 to support mood and those PMS-related breakouts, and chasteberry to help balance hormones. We're talking prolactin and progesterone support. But my personal favorite is that I was already taking a pill supplement for bromelain, and now I just take the Glow Super Powder from Beam. And if you didn't know, bromelain is an anti-inflammatory that helps your vocal cords. and I've been having issues with straining mine because I talk for hours recording these videos. So anything that can help me bounce back from vocal strain is a win. And now it's added to the one step I do every day. So easy. From the very first month I tried Glow Super Powder from Beam, my moods felt steadier, my PMS felt more manageable to me, and it really has become my get ready to be human step every morning. But it's not an overnight fix. It works best with daily use, and most people will notice changes after a few months. And I just toss a single serve stick in my bag and pour it into water on the go, and I'm done. And it tastes really good. I love the watermelon flavor. And right now, you can get early access to their biggest sale of the year, up to 50% off. The 30-day subscription will go from $65 to about $32.50, and that's the lowest price ever. And it's expected to sell out. So it's the perfect time to stock up for the holidays or even the colder months when you may need more of a boost. So I highly recommend giving Glow Women's Super Powder a try and shop my early access link and get up to 50% off. Just go to shopbeam.com/Kimber and use my code Kimber for a limited time. So check it out today. And thanks so much to Beam for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back into the case for today. Sorry, my videos are a little late in the year this time, but these episodes during the Halloween season are naturally going to emphasize Halloween, the nostalgia, the traditions, and the haunting tone that it can set, especially when we're talking about real life tragedies. Let's go back to Halloween night in 2004. It's a little after 7 p.m. The streets are glowing, jack-o'-lanterns are grinning from porches, porch lights flickering, trick-or-treaters dragging pillowcases full of candy on the ground. It's the one night of the year where ghosts walk with feet, where monsters knock politely and ask for chocolate. And it's still early when 27-year-old Lauren had gotten home from a long day of shopping and playing soccer. She was exhausted, and she was glad to be back. But she wasn't that happy that trick-or-treaters were continuously coming to the door that night. She loved the holiday, but her older dog, Chloe, a German Shepherd mix, would get really anxious and overwhelmed with every knock or ring of their doorbell. But of course, Lauren wasn't going to ruin the fun, so she let old Chloe bark while her two roommates passed out candy. Adrian and Leslie were both 26. They shared the rental home with Lauren, and they were so excited to hand out candy. They were laughing and enjoying every minute of it, even getting a kick out of Chloe freaking out like a guard dog. And by 9 p.m., it was dwindling. It was Sunday. So that was kind of a good thing since they all had to work the next morning. They made a bite to eat, sat on the couch, watched TV for a bit, and then one by one, the girls went off to bed. First Leslie, then Adrian, and finally around 11:30 p.m., Lauren got tired, so she did what she normally did. She went around the house to every door and made sure they were closed and locked, especially the sliding glass door, since there was a habit of letting Chloe out and not securing it afterward. Once that was done, Lauren went to bed with Chloe, and it was a pretty uneventful evening. Another Halloween checked off, but the first in their new home together. Just three good friends enjoying the beautiful rolling hills, the crisp autumn air in their cozy Northern California neighborhood. But in the middle of that quiet night, once all the trick-or-treaters had gone home and Lauren was sleeping, something awful happened. Now, she wouldn't know it until 2 a.m. when her dog started to growl loudly and wouldn't stop. The motion-activated light in the backyard went on. That wasn't that unusual. It could be a cat or maybe another kind of animal just scampering through the backyard. But then she heard something inside the house. And at first it sounded as though either Leslie or Adrian had let a visitor inside. And that wouldn't be surprising. Both of them were dating. However, when Lauren began hearing bumping, she got annoyed. They had just had a talk about bringing guys back to the house and being loud in the bedrooms, romping around while Lauren was trying to sleep. Her bedroom was on the first floor, so the noise carried from above. She really hoped that her roommates weren't disregarding her wishes. But then she heard it. A scream that echoed from upstairs, and she knew right away it was serious. And now she realized those bumps in the night were probably a struggle. She had to think very fast because someone was inside their home. Lauren slowly opened her bedroom door. She quietly stepped out, and she was right underneath the stairs. All she could hear was screaming over and over again. And then she heard someone running and their footsteps pounding against the hardwood floors, and she thought that she was going to be next. It was survival instinct. Lauren turned around and she saw the back door just feet away, and she made a run for it. She burst outside, clutching her dog, and she can still hear the screams echoing throughout the house. It's the kind of sound that doesn't belong in real life. It's the kind that only happens in movies, where post-production audio engineers boost the dial on everything that makes your skin crawl. But this couldn't be from a movie. It was too close, and it floated through the same air that Lauren was breathing in and out heavily, frozen in place. The yard was dark and it was fenced in, and she had nowhere to run. She hid in the shadows, shaking. Her dog was trembling against her chest, and for a moment, all she could hear was her own heartbeat. And then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, moving inside the house, and then a light clicks on upstairs, and she waits in silence. Finally, she forces herself back inside that house, and just as she's coming through the back door, she hears a noise. Right in front of the house, she sees a shadowy figure in the dark pushing the wooden blinds out of the way on the front porch window and climbing out. She's as stiff as a statue. She's not even breathing. At that moment, she realized maybe she hadn't checked if the windows were fastened before heading to bed that night. But she couldn't dwell on that now. She was looking for the cordless phone. She knew she needed to call for help fast, and she found it, but it wasn't working. She thought, this cannot be happening. She could hear a voice, a cry for help, and she could tell it was Adrienne. She was saying, "Please, God, help me. Somebody help me." And Lauren followed her friend's cries and made her way upstairs. The smell hit her first, metallic and sharp. It stung her nostrils. She looked into the first room at the top of the stairs, which was Leslie's room, but keeps going because she could still hear Adrienne. There was a small light on in her room, and her eyes were beginning to adjust as she entered. She noticed the floor was slick under her feet, and it doesn't take long for her to realize that it's blood, and it's everywhere. It's all over the walls, it's on the bed, and there's a large pool of it on the floor, and a trail coming from the hallway where she just entered. Lauren is trying to make out what she's looking at on the floor, and at first it looks like a pile of clothing, but on top, face down, was one of her roommates, with stab wounds covering her body. She wasn't moving. And behind her on the bed, another victim. It was Adrienne. She's still breathing, but barely, and she's staring straight up at her and whispering something. A prayer, or maybe the word help. Lauren couldn't make it out, but she sprinted downstairs, grabbed her cell phone and her dog, ran into the garage, got into her car, turned it on, and backed out as fast as she could. She's calling 911, trying to relay what was happening. She says, "My roommates, they've been attacked, and I think they're dying, I swear." Lauren's in shock. She's afraid. She thinks the killer may come back and kill her too. She drove to the end of the block and she waited until those officers arrived. She didn't dare go back inside that house. Imagine what it would be like for police to be racing to a scene like this right after Halloween night. On the outside, it's an ordinary tree-lined residential street, except carved pumpkins still glow faintly on porches, fake spiderwebs purposely attached to homes that are usually immaculately cleaned, and gravestones posed and propped on lawns, almost mocking the dead, with funny sayings like, "Here lies my remains," or "crispy bacon," all fitting for the season. All acceptable decorations on All Hallows Eve. But inside the doors of 2631 Dorset Street, nothing is for show. It's chaos and quiet all at once. A witch dangling from the porch greets the officers, ironically, in the worst way, as if to say, this place is haunted. Officers Darlene Elia and Sergeant Pat Manzer were dispatched first. They arrived around the same time. It was 2:13 a.m. when they made their way inside with their guns drawn. Backup was already on the way. When they got to the stairs, they were covered in bloody footprints. And as they got to the hallway above, there was even more blood, concentrated and smeared all over the place, but coming from the first bedroom and into the second, where both victims were located. Officer Kimbyrleigha had never seen anything like this in her career. She literally thought to herself, I feel like I'm in a horror movie. Now, by the next morning, real crime scene tapes surrounded the house, and both sides of Dorset Street were blocked off to through traffic. The quiet street was now lined with police cruisers, crime scene vans, unmarked cars belonging to homicide detectives, and even reporters. In this small town, it wasn't hard to find out that something big had happened. Small-time reporters were already asking questions, hoping to get a hit story. A double homicide on Halloween night? They could already tell this story could write itself. But the victims had names: Leslie Mazzara and Adrian Insania. They were more than a headline. They were both young women building lives that they were proud of, chasing their careers, love, and a version of happiness that until Halloween night had felt completely within their reach. Leslie was the newest roommate to join the trio. She was a Southern belle, soft-spoken, radiant, and a stunning former beauty queen from South Carolina who had just come to California chasing sunshine and a new start. She worked in marketing for a winery nearby, charming guests, making them feel seen, and hoping to wow her boss so she could move up in her career. She loved to dance, she loved pageants, and she loved life itself. Her friend said she was the person you would notice first when you walked into a room, and the one that you would miss the most when she left. Leslie Ann Mazzara was born on August 1st of 1978 in Orlando, Florida, to Lenny Mazzara and Kathy Harrington. And soon, Leslie was raised entirely by her single mother, Kathy, who had become a young mother at 18 to two boys, Paul and Andy, by the time she was 22. And at 27, she gave birth to her only daughter, Leslie, and right away, it was different. The bond that they shared was just so special. She was so close to her, sleeping right by her bed. And she remembers how little Leslie would sit up in her crib and wake her up by saying, "Hi," in the cutest baby voice. That sounds so adorable. And this family ended up moving to Anderson, South Carolina, where Leslie was raised, a small town where money wasn't exactly abundant in Leslie's life, but love and effort were. And the family's running joke was that Leslie, the only girl, got princess treatment. Her brothers would tease her, but then they would turn around and defend her like it was their job. They were messy, they were noisy, but they were loyal. From the time she could talk about when she grew up, Leslie didn't pick one lane. She wanted to be a mom, a teacher, and a nurse, and that does sound like a kid answer. But if you look at the pattern in her life, it tracks, because every role that Leslie took on was about caretaking and showing up for people. That instinct never left. But she had other loves in her life. Dance was one of them, where she found both discipline and joy. She trained seriously. Greenville Ballet Company, and then she earned a spot at the South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts. This wasn't just after-school ballet. It was early mornings, blistered toes, and learning how to push herself when her body said to stop. The art school sharpened her posture, her poise, and her stage presence, the kind of confidence that you can see across a room without her even saying a word. Leslie had always been an adorable little girl, but as she got older, she grew into a gorgeous young woman. She had dark hair, green eyes, and she just had this warm Southern hospitality that shined through and made her memorable. She had big dreams. After high school, she headed to the University of Georgia and earned a philosophy degree, and it fit her whole ask bigger questions brain. Less about memorizing answers and more about how people think and why choices matter. She kept the dancer's grace, but she layered it with this quiet, thoughtful side. She could come into a room and sit down and listen to you. And there were two special people in Leslie's life who loved her for who she was for as long as they had known her. They grew up with her, her two best friends, Kelly McCorkle from 9th grade ballet class and Amy Brown, who had known her since she was 15. They met at church. Kelly did pageants, and Leslie would see all the crowns in Kelly's room. She would try them on for fun, but she would daydream out loud. And Kelly wasn't the gatekeeping kind of friend. She told Leslie, "You should go for it." And then she helped her with the application to do her first pageant. That mattered. Leslie entered, she competed, and she won Miss Williamston in 2002. Then she went on to Miss South Carolina in 2003. She was perfect for it. All around American girl. Beauty, brains, and personality. But here's the important part. Leslie didn't just wear the sash and the crown. She used it. Her platform was child safety and abuse prevention, and she made it urgent and visible. She staged a sit marathon at the Anderson Mall inside a taped-off box that matched the size of the bathroom where a child, Stephanie Crane, was held and treated very badly before she died. And that's heavy. It was an intentional story to force people passing by to feel the feeling and the cruelty of that small space that a child should never have known. And by the end, Leslie raised almost $1,000 for Calvary Home, a foster care nonprofit. It wasn't performative. This was something that mattered. It was empathy, and it translated into action for Leslie. Leslie was good at bringing awareness to causes like this that she cared about, but she would use her looks to grab attention and pull people in and then get them involved with her ambition for change. Amy called Leslie enchanting. She was a charmer. She loved people, and Amy knew everything about her best friend. She was her confidant. She said that Leslie was a hopeless romantic to a fault. She would meet a guy, she would fall hard for him fast, hoping each time they would turn out to be her Prince Charming. There were so many men interested in Leslie that Amy lost count of how many boyfriends Leslie had in her lifetime. Boyfriend after boyfriend, she would open her heart as wide as it could go, even if it meant being heartbroken. She didn't do anything halfway when it came to love, which made every guy like her even more. But it didn't take much for them to fall in love with her either. And Amy was right there through every excited first date to every heartache and breakup. Amy noticed that many of the men Leslie dated would love bomb her. I don't think they used to call it that back then, but for example, one of her boyfriends, Brian West, actually bought her a new car only about 2 months after they began dating. Leslie didn't ask for a car and she didn't need a car, but that was the type of thing that a guy did for Leslie. They would fall at her feet, giving her gifts, pampering her, treating her like a princess, hoping for more. But things ended with Brian after a few months, and of course, Leslie gave the car back. But Brian wasn't over her. He went on to create an entire website, almost worshiping Leslie like a digital shrine. He dedicated the poem Silken Tent by Robert Frost to Leslie, which compared a woman to a silken tent to say they're delicate but resilient. Imagine a tent loosely tied but secure enough not to fall. It was meant to showcase Leslie as graceful, delicate, but strong, and a romantic relationship that explores love with liberty. While she was free to love, there were also ties connecting her, keeping her grounded, possibly ties to Brian, at least in his heart. As nice as it may sound, Amy thought it was not normal for a guy that Leslie broke up with to go out of his way to create posts like this. However, she said, you know what? She wasn't surprised. He was so in love with Leslie, it was almost a form of admiration. In her words, he idolized her, and many people did. It doesn't exactly sound healthy, and he wasn't the only one who bought Leslie nice things and tried to win her affection. It was a constant thing. And it wasn't uncommon for Leslie to be giving a number of guys attention at the same time until she chose to get more serious with one of them. The ones she rejected weren't always happy about it. They would try to somehow stick around and be a part of her life, even if they didn't become her boyfriend. But Leslie was looking for the one. She wasn't going to settle. She'd give men a chance, but if they were not up to her standards, it was on to the next. Leslie wasn't all about men, though. She cared about a lot of things. Career-wise, at first she worked for Kennedy and Price on Lady Street in South Carolina. It was office life, answering phones, booking clients, managing a calendar, and she did all of it with a smile. And then came the pivot that changed everything. Leslie's mom, Kathy, was finishing up a degree out in California, and she and Leslie were very close. Leslie confided in her mom that she was feeling a little lost in life. She wasn't sure whether she should go to grad school or she should go into a career. And Kathy kind of made a funny but kind of serious suggestion. She said, why not come to California, drink some wine, and have fun until you figure out where to go in your life? Leslie was always up for a new chapter, and she wanted to be close as she could to her mother, so she took her up on that offer. Now, at this point in her life, Leslie had been in a long-term relationship with a lawyer. His name was William Lee Youngblood Jr. He went by Lee, and so did his father, Lee Sr., speaking of men who wanted to stay in her life after they broke up. Because at the time she was deciding to leave for the West Coast, she was living with Lee, and she thought that maybe leaving the state would give her a reason to break up with him. It was something on her mind because his father made her feel very uncomfortable. This was a powerful family. They had money. They were well known in the area. And at first she pictured herself marrying Lee. She loved him. But after a while, Lee Sr. was just a little too close for comfort. He would hit on Leslie. And Amy said that he seemed to be obsessed with her. He was a married man, but also her boyfriend's father. So she did it. She broke it off, she packed up, and she left for California. Now, this part of Northern California where she moved isn't just pretty hills and wine tastings. It's like hospitality is a craft. And of course, for the queen of Southern hospitality herself, Leslie fit right in. It was like it was in her blood. Leslie immediately found a job in marketing at Francis Ford Coppola's estate in Rutherford as a concierge and sales rep. Now, Francis Ford Coppola, if you don't know, is an American filmmaker known for The Godfather, among a lot of other classics and famous films. And this job let every part of Leslie's personality shine. This place is legendary. There are events every night of the week, especially during peak seasons and the holidays. I'm talking scenic tours of the park, food and wine tastings, Halloween carnivals, Christmas parties. It was a social butterfly's dream come true. And Thursday nights were Leslie's favorite. Dance events, where yes, the boss himself would sometimes come, and Leslie would kind of half-jokingly tell her friends she hoped she would get discovered by him one of those nights. She would say with a little smirk, but there was some truth under that. She did want to be noticed. And she was. The CEO, Jay Shoemaker, described Leslie with words like style, grace, and poise. Not just pretty, but present. When Leslie's mom eventually decided to relocate again, this time from Northern California to Michigan, Leslie didn't follow. By then, she was fully in love with the West Coast. The weather, the pace, the feeling that life was happening there. She stayed in the valley, built a routine and a community, and eventually met friends that she clicked with. Socially, Leslie was thriving. She connected with people very easily, and she did date a lot. She was in that phase of, I'm young, I'm still figuring things out. But she did have that type of beauty that turned heads. But what actually pulled people into her was how she made you feel like you mattered. And there was a steady stream of visitors coming back to the Dorset Street house. It was nothing reckless. It was just casual fun. And I think since we're all adults here, Leslie was just being an adult, doing adult mingling and getting to know guys in town. No harm in that. I mentioned that she was the newest roommate to the area. The three women came together because of Lauren, and I'm going to get into that in just a moment. But Leslie didn't disconnect from her home, even all the way in California. Her best friend Amy had just gotten married a few weeks ago, and Leslie had flown back home to be one of her bridesmaids. And then just a couple weeks before Halloween, Leslie's college friends Katie Norris and Vanessa Schur came to visit the Dorset home. They hung out with all three roommates. They went out on the town with Leslie, and they had so much fun. It was now unbelievable that Leslie was gone forever. When these girls moved in together, it wasn't just about being in this leased home. It was just a launch pad to everything they were doing in their life. Work, friends, late night recaps. I'm sure you can just picture it. I told you Lauren was the one that brought Leslie and Adrian together. She was the common thread between them. So let me tell you all about Adrian and how she met Lauren and eventually moved into the Dorset Street home. If Leslie was known as being the bright light in the group, Adrian could be known as the architect. Leslie and Adrian were kind of opposites. Adrian was analytical, detail-oriented, and she thought in numbers. She was the girl who didn't just admire a bridge, she wanted to know everything about it. Load limits, soil type beneath it, the way the wind would flex the steel. An engineering mind. Adrian Michelle Insania was born December 30th of 1977. She was a Christmas baby. Her parents are Arlene and Tony, and Adrian was the second of four. First came Alexandria, known as Lexi. She was 4 years older than Adrian. Then after Adrian, 3 years later, was Allison, and then finally Michael in 2001. He was the baby of the family. They all grew up in a loud, supportive, the kind of family that we tease you because we love you. And there was bickering. Whose turn is it to do the dishes? Who stole my hoodie? But there was also this dependable theme of we've got your back. That foundation mattered later on in life. At 10 years old, a huge change happened. Arlene and Tony got divorced. When Arlene was trying to put her life back together, she thought about a place that she visited once that she fell in love with, Calistoga, California. The family packed up and they moved from Texas to Calistoga. It was in Northern California. It was a new town, a new school, and a new everything. That area in the 90s was all about the good life, about vineyards, about field trips, and neighbors who learn even your dog's names, and that's so California. It's even true today here in Los Angeles. But it's also where Adrian's interests came into focus. She was a Girl Scout, and her badges weren't just cute, they were proof that she had skills. She loved anything that she could make with her hands. Other kids were building castles in sand while Adrian was figuring out how to make a real-life drawbridge work. And growing up, it wasn't as though she was just playing engineer. She was one. She just hadn't collected the degree yet. She clearly had a knack for figuring out how things worked. Arlene tells the best version of those years. She said Adrian was at the kitchen table, head down with determination, studying a problem with total calm. Like frustration didn't even exist. Give her a challenge, and she would sit with it until it clicked. And she wasn't loud about it. She wasn't showboating. She just had this soft smile across her face that meant that she had solved it. And by 13, she said the quiet part out loud. She said, I'm going to be an engineer. It wasn't a maybe. It wasn't an I think. Adrian had plans. She knew she wanted to do this for the rest of her life. That's pretty young to know what you want to be in the future. But that was Adrian. In high school, she stacked her schedule with architecture, woodshop, AutoCAD, and she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty or look unfeminine, using a torque wrench or tools. And she was athletic. She played volleyball because she said she liked the physics of it, the way a perfect set feels inevitable when everyone's timing is right. And that's thinking with numbers, which I don't do. I cannot relate to that. But someone like her, I can just picture. And then by June of 1994, something really terrible happened. It was a mother's worst nightmare. It was the beginning of summer. The girls were all at home. And Arlene asked Adrian, who was new to driving, if she would take the car and go run some errands for her. What 16-year-old would say no to having a car to themselves? So Adrian, of course, said yes. It was a 1981 Thunderbird, an older car that Arlene kept as a backup, just something to use around the town. She expected this trip to maybe take an hour, not much more than that. She told Adrian to please call her when she returned. But when that call never came, Arlene called the house, and Allison answered. Arlene asked if Adrian was back yet, and Allison said no. And I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but anytime we talk about cases that happened in the 90s, I always say this was before cell phones. Not everyone was wearing a pager either. So there was no way for Arlene to get in touch with Adrian. So she just had to wait. She returned home after work, and Allison was literally standing in the driveway with a very concerned look on her face. And Arlene knew right then that something wasn't right. As soon as she stepped out of the car, Allison told her that she received a really concerning call from the hospital, and they had told her that Adrian had been in an accident. Arlene lost it. She immediately needed to know what was going on. She called the hospital in a panic, but she couldn't get any information other than what Allison already told her. Adrian was in an accident. Arlene had so many thoughts swirling in her head. Some of them were being said out loud, but she wasn't getting the answers. Instead, she was like, I better get there quick. It was even more confusing when Arlene and Allison made it to the hospital because it wasn't just Adrian who had been injured. There were 3 boys her age also hospitalized. You can probably imagine what Arlene was thinking. What happened here? No one was talking because unfortunately all 3 teenagers were hooked up to machines and they were also in bad shape. But Adrian was probably the worst. They said she was lucky to be alive. Adrian took one look at her daughter and was in total shock. Her head was swollen. It looked deformed. On one side, it was blown up triple in size than the other. It was unreal. And of course, you know, She had all these machines beeping around her, the wires, the cords, and looking at that, it was heartbreaking. And she didn't even know her prognosis at the time. What they did know was that Adrienne apparently wasn't even driving her mother's Thunderbird. That was surprising to Arlene. And then they told her that Adrienne was pulled from the passenger seat. It was a rollover accident. She could have been ejected. If she hadn't been wearing her seatbelt, she would probably have been dead. The car rolled at least 3 times, and the right side of Adrienne's head was hitting the road every single time through that window. It had either broken or been left open, but that is just horrifying. And after all of these children were stabilized, Arlene got the truth, or as much as they could tell her from what she was able to gather. Adrienne was out doing errands when she started talking to 3 boys from her school. Now, these were not boys that she knew very well. They were just acquaintances. And for whatever reason, one of them convinced her to let him drive to Napa Valley, about 20 minutes away, to a very touristy area. And here's the thing. The kid driving didn't even have a license. He was only 15. Wow. He was speeding. He swerved off the road. He tried to gain control of the car, and it flipped. Not on its side, because at first it actually flipped forward and then it rolled. And I kept thinking, poor Adrienne. Try not to blame her, because I know my motherly side, and even Arlene admitted she was mad at first before she realized that Adrienne had been in such a bad accident and that she wasn't going to be coming home. But of course, as a parent, there is that other side where you feel bad, but you're also upset, thinking, why would Adrienne let somebody else drive the car? But we can't get into the mind of a 16-year-old. That wasn't even important to Arlene in the moment, because Adrienne was in critical condition. She suffered severe trauma to her head, and they thought she wasn't even going to make it. Miraculously, she did, but it was not an easy road to recovery. She had to undergo several surgeries, even cosmetic surgery, to correct the slash on her face that went right through her ear. Healing isn't just about the physical wounds. It's about how someone feels on the inside psychologically. And it was hard to see yourself that way. Looking in the mirror and not seeing yourself the way that you usually look. Arlene actually brought photos of Adrienne into the hospital so she could see what she looked like before as a reminder and help boost her confidence. She had a goal to get back to herself again. Afterward, the pain was chronic and complicated. She had headaches, she was lightheaded, she would be dizzy, and she was also in a fog. She did have temporary brain damage. The physical healing was also very hard, and the emotional part was even harder. Her stamina had dropped. Her independence was gone. Suddenly you have to rely on others more than ever. But Adrienne let herself be human about it. There were days it broke her, and her family would have to support her a lot, but she just kept going. And eventually she even went back to school, even within just a few months, and she caught up. Not because she had anything to prove to anyone else. It was because her future self, future Adrienne, wasn't going to leave her goals behind. And people noticed. A local program called If Given a Chance looked at her story, her grind, and they didn't just see a survivor. They saw an engineer in the making, and they awarded her a scholarship to Cal Poly. And that mattered. Of course, there was the financial part, but there was also the symbolic part. It was a community saying that we believe in who you're becoming. Now, if the name Cal Poly sounds familiar, that's because in last week's case, that case happened at California Polytechnic University, where Rachel Newhouse was attending at the time. So if that rang a bell, that's why. Same school. Cal Poly was the perfect fit for Adrienne. She went right into her classes for her civil engineering degree. She also gave back to her community. She became a Girl Scout troop leader, passing down the same things that she had learned. She also stepped up in the Society for Civil Engineers and the legendary concrete canoe tradition. She also did that. And I didn't know anything about it, but apparently every year the American Society of Civil Engineers have a competition where students design, build, and race canoes entirely made out of concrete. By 2001, Adrienne now had her degree and she had a lot of options. She could easily chase money or prestige, but she chose proximity to the people that she loved the most and the place that felt like home, Northern California. So when the Napa Sanitation District posted a job opening, she went for it, even though it drew hundreds of applicants, many people that were older with a lot more experience, and most of them were men. She was only 23, just out of college, walking into a male-dominated space, but she was confident, and she landed the job. I wouldn't have expected anything less. I know I don't have to tell you this, but it definitely wasn't luck. It was mastery. She made her coworkers believe in her because she believed in the work that she was doing. And her mom would joke that by her 40s, Adrienne would be running the whole operation. And no one laughed about that because it was probable. And I'm sure you've looked over at a coworker and you think, okay, I'm looking at my future boss. That was Adrienne. But she wasn't all about work. She had a very social side. She loved making friends and she made them easily. But she was also picky, and she chose wisely. At work, she found her best friend, Lily Prudhomme, a fellow engineer with the same humor and the same drive. And their friendship had that really easy feeling where you just click right away. It started as just a work thing, and it turned into late night debriefs, long days, and then spontaneous Saturdays that started with coffee and would end with trips to Home Depot just to look around. Their Home Depot runs would be, other girls' home good runs. Lily lived in town, and Adrienne was commuting and looking for a more permanent place to call her home, closer to work and closer to her friends. And that is where Lauren comes in. I told you that she brought all the roommates together. Lauren Mienza was a local and she coached volleyball at the community college level. And Adrienne, who I told you loved volleyball, took a volleyball class, and that is where the two of them met. Lauren was the type of person that was very reliable, and you already know Adrienne's personality, so the two hit it off right away. And they started talking about looking for a place to rent together. And in February of 2004, Lauren saw the Dorset Street house for rent. So she ran it by Adrienne, and she said yes right away. One, it was walking distance to Adrienne's best friend Lily's house, and it was 1 block away from Adrienne's boyfriend's house, Christian Lee. I'll tell you about him in just a moment. But doesn't that sound perfect? You're walking distance to your BFF and your BF. It was like, sign me up, and they signed the lease together. It was a 4-bedroom house though, so they thought it would be nice to at least split the rent with one more girl because the 4th room would stay open for guests. But one more roommate would be ideal, and that's when Lauren thought of Leslie. But that wasn't until June, when Leslie was looking for a place to stay because her mother was moving to Michigan. In those months between February and June, when it was only Lauren and Adrienne, it was full of get-togethers for housewarming. It was Lauren's first time living on her own, so we all know the fun of decorating, setting your room up just right, and making a place for Chloe, her dog. And it made sense that Lauren would take the 1st floor bedroom near the kitchen and the sliding glass door with a fenced-in backyard, so she could easily take her dog out. Adrienne took the back bedroom on the left upstairs, and eventually Leslie claimed the 1st bedroom on the left, right? When you get up the stairs, there was a bathroom between their 2 rooms, and the guest bedroom was across the hall. This is important for later. So right when you come up those stairs, Leslie's bedroom was the very first one on the left. It made sense that the more social girls were upstairs together. Their rooms would be a little further from Lauren's, and she was the more quiet roommate. Leslie, Adrienne, and Adrienne's best friend Lily were more of the getting dolled up, going out and partying, drinking, and hanging out type. And both Adrienne and Lily had boyfriends. Leslie was looking for one, so it just made sense that they all clicked. That year also marked 10 years since Adrienne's terrible accident. It was the day that she and Lily called the day she was supposed to die. They wanted to celebrate Adrienne's life, so they took the day off, they went to an amusement park, they ate junk food, and they treated it like a holiday. It was honoring the math of Adrienne's life, the probability that she wasn't supposed to be here, but she was. So they celebrated that. Adrienne was here on borrowed time, as they would say. But I also told you that I want to talk about Adrienne's boyfriend. Now, romance-wise, Adrienne was not as calculated, and that is a jab to her good math skills because in this case, it seemed like the math wasn't mathing. Christian Lee, they were in an on-again, off-again kind of relationship or situationship. They had their good days, and then they had arguments, and they wouldn't hide it. They would argue right in front of Lauren, Lily, and Leslie, and it was uncomfortable. Adrienne would confide in Lily. She would tell her all the updates, and sometimes she would actually show up to work crying. She would open up. She was honest about possibly wanting more than maybe with Christian. He was 25 years old, and he just wasn't ready to settle down, and Lily could kind of relate. She was their same age, and she was navigating an 8-year relationship with her fiancé, also 25 years old. That's Eric Koppel. They met in high school and had been dating since they were 17. High school sweethearts, so Lily could understand what Adrian was going through. They both knew that things weren't perfect, and they were kind of reevaluating things. They were each other's support system. They would spend hours gossiping about their love lives, and when they weren't with their men, they were planning fun things to do together. Girl things. They were actually planning a trip out to Australia to visit Adrian's mom and sister who were out there at the time. Adrian and Lily had their itinerary already mapped out. It was going to be happening in November. So these girls had so many plans. They were really looking forward to Christmas because Leslie promised to introduce all of her Southern-style traditions, the food, the desserts, the decor. They were so excited, but they never had a chance. So now we are back to Halloween. And I really hope I did do a good job painting a picture of these women. They had no idea what would happen on Halloween night, after the kids were done trick-or-treating, after they were all asleep in their beds. It's the morning of November 1st. Neighbors have to blink a few times to understand what they're looking at. Real crime scene tape, not Halloween decor, draped across the lot at 2631 Dorset Street. 2 young women dead on Halloween night. As you can imagine, reporters were already trying to think of taglines for this case. They were there on Dorset Street, flagging down officers, asking what was going on. And I've seen a lot of these articles. Nightmare on Halloween, Halloween horror, things like that. And I'm not any better because I do need to come up with a title for this video or no one will watch it. It's a requirement. I get it. But I can just picture actual people clamoring around outside of a crime scene for information. It paints a picture of the chaos that the neighbors saw when they woke up. Detectives had actually been there since 3 a.m., and they were still there when the sun came up, but residents had been asleep. It wasn't apparent that something horrific had occurred until they were coming outside to walk their dogs, grab the morning paper, or go for a walk, when they realized their street was full of official vehicles, news trucks, a coroner's van. But it was important to talk about those detectives that were on the scene. One of them was Detective Kirk Primo. He had been with the police department for 14 years at the time. I already told you that a couple first responders had come to the scene from the police department. Those officers made sure that no one was inside, they cleared every room, they saw the victims, and they reported that they needed backup. But homicide detectives were now on scene, as well as crime scene analysts. And Detective Primo only had to take a simple look inside and realize that there had already been some contamination on the stairs. Those bare footprints that were actually coming down were Lauren's. She went upstairs to find her friends, and then she ran back down to call the police. So he decided in that moment, instead of having a bunch of detectives walking up and down the stairs in this small house and into those bedrooms, they wanted to take a look at everything from an upstairs window. They used a ladder and they looked inside of Adrian's bedroom, and they were able to ascertain the positioning of the bodies and all the other things they could take pictures of from that vantage point. This was a small bedroom. It was only about 9 by 12. So that was also a concern. Having so many people trying to get in there, they wanted to preserve as much evidence as possible before the collection took place. The size of this room also comes into play with the fact these girls were trapped. There was no place for them to go. Adrian was basically pushed up against a wall in the corner on top of the bed. And if this is giving you deja vu, or you're having a flashback to the Idaho case, Kaylee and Maddie, I understand that. And you can find a lot of articles and posts online comparing these 2 cases to one another, starting with the fact that there was a survivor in the house who saw the perpetrator was frozen in fear in both cases, and eventually called 911. Even though in the Idaho case, it took much longer. And there are some similarities. I'm not going to say there isn't, but overall, these cases are not the same. I will point to some things that have been written about extensively, actually, but I assure you, the similarities end pretty quickly. I know one of the things that's important to me and also to you is finding out more about the crime scene, so let's start with one of the forensic specialists on scene. By 2:30 in the morning, Janet Lipsey was there, and she had been on the force for nearly 30 years. Her job was to collect anything of evidentiary value and photograph the scene. Here are the most important findings that will come into play. Initially, when walking in the front door, it was immediately apparent, and we already know this because we have a survivor that was able to give an account, which we'll talk about in a moment, but it was apparent that the perpetrator had come out through the window to the left of the front door. This was a push-up style window, and it had been unlocked, something that Lauren thought about later, that she hadn't checked every window. It had been a very cool autumn at the time. People were leaving their windows open for the breeze to come in, even in the evening, and it was closed at the end of the night, but unfortunately not locked. This was where the perpetrator gained entry and left. He was seen leaving by Lauren and climbing out that window, and on the metal siding outside, they found blood, which was collected, photographed, and swabbed for DNA. Now, naturally, when they got inside, they examined the other side of that window. There was blood on the wooden blinds that you could see, and they were disheveled, showing they were forcefully pushed aside as the perpetrator came and went. Right underneath that window, there were black plastic zip ties. They had a rubber band around them, and it appeared the perpetrator dropped them either on the way in or the way out. These type of zip ties can be used to control the victim, possibly to tie their hands behind their back or other body parts. So immediately, this was noted because that can go to a motive, to bind or to tie one or all of these women and carry out some sick plan. Now, I'm going to get to more of that later, but this was significant and they were collected as well. Another thing to note is that the garage door is just steps away from this window, and that is where Lauren ran after she saw the perpetrator leave. So if you had been wondering how she knew that she would essentially be safe, her bedroom is close to this kitchen area. And when he was coming in, she was hearing all that commotion and the noises, the bumping. She was able to look out and have a good view of both the stairway and the front window. Out of these three roommates, Lauren probably had the best advantage to flee if she had been attacked. But it's very interesting to detectives at this point that the perpetrator went straight upstairs and he didn't go check Lauren's room. That made this look targeted, another similarity to the Idaho case. The killer also made a beeline for the room upstairs, going towards motive and intent. Detectives already started building a theory as they were seeing all this evidence. The rest of the downstairs was untouched, so they started making their way upstairs to collect evidence, and that is where the bloody staircase comes in. There were two significant aspects. I already talked about the bare footprints belonging to Lauren. The blood was from upstairs, most likely a mixture of the two victims, and we're going to get to all of the DNA evidence as well. But beside those footprints were droplets, pretty large droplets that were round in shape, and when you see this type of blood evidence, it's usually from the weapon, from the blood that's on the weapon and is dripping down as the perpetrator is walking or running away. It was important for all of these different smears, footprints, and droplets to be swabbed because the killer could have possibly harmed themselves and their blood could have been left behind. It had been noted in reports that multiple detectives and analysts mentioned that this was the bloodiest crime scene they had ever been a part of analyzing. And with that being said, that's another similarity to the Idaho case. And don't worry, I won't be talking about the similarities much longer. But in the Idaho case, there was so much blood evidence and other items collected, it was overwhelming. There was also 4 people killed in that case, so that's to be expected. But in a small town like this, they had 71 pieces of DNA evidence, and that was extremely rare. One of the analysts said that maybe 2 or 3 was common, but there was just an overwhelming amount in this case. Other than these cases both being stabbings, that was where the similarities pretty much end. The reason why there were so many pieces of evidence in this case was because we're talking about a town that had never seen anything like this before. And I think we can liken that to Moscow, Idaho, and the college town. So if you are wondering, those were the things people connected in these cases and kind of analyzed online. But again, that's really where the similarities end. But speaking of a bloody crime scene, as they make their way to the top floor and right into Leslie's bedroom, which is the first room that you come to when you make it up those stairs, there was so much blood. Something that this platform here does not like me to show, so I have to blur this entire picture. But you can kind of make out what's going on here. I tried to figure things out as well. It looked like to me the cordless phone sitting on the right and also the base of that phone, which makes sense because someone tried to grab it and use it, and the base was pulled from the wall, making it useless. The reason there's a lot of blood in this area is because Leslie appeared to have probably been in this area as she was being attacked, as she was trying to leave. She ends up in the next room over, which is where Adrian was sleeping. She had been woken up by all the noise and she turned on a light. That was the light that Lauren saw from outside. It was turned on while she was hiding, and there is a smear or a stream or trail of blood leading from Leslie's room right into Adrian's. Detectives couldn't be sure if Leslie was dragged in there, if she was crawling in there to get help. No one could know for sure, but it was obvious to detectives that the killer came into Leslie's room first, which again was important for motive. If Adrian hadn't woken up, they wondered, would there have been 2 homicides? Was the perpetrator there to take Leslie by force? She screamed and she fought, because she did fight for her life hard. And it could have been the case that the killer was blocking the exit on the stairs, so Leslie had no other choice and nowhere else to run except to Adrian. There was a phone in Adrian's room, but the only problem was that once the other phone was ripped from the wall, there was no way to use any of the phones because the other one was off the hook. If you've had a corded phone, even if it's cordless, you'll remember if you pick one up, try to dial with it, leave it on, you can't use the other one. The phone in Adrian's room was laying on the side table and it was useless. Looking in Leslie's room, the way that the blood patterns existed on her bed sheets seemed to point to her being asleep when she was attacked. And because there's none where she would be laying, it appeared as though she woke up by maybe someone grabbing her, putting their hand over her mouth, doing something that would make her sit up and try to figure out what was going on. And at that point, it appears she had been stabbed again and again. And this was absolutely brutal. And yes, I am going to go over the autopsy report, but the side of Leslie's bed had smears and swipes that showed movement, as if she was trying to get away. And there was a lot more blood below her bed on the bedskirt and the pillows that had fallen to the floor, as well as a lot of droplets showing a lot of active bleeding while standing or kneeling, as well as cast off on the walls. Now moving to Adrian's room. Leslie's body was face down in a pile of dirty clothes at the end of Adrian's bed. Obviously, this was the bloodiest portion of this entire house. I heard that there were 2 inches of blood in there. I don't know if that's true. It was in a report I read, but this is where both of the girls ended up passing away. It is where Adrian was in an active struggle as well. She was attacked near or on the bed and had bled out, with Leslie on the floor taking her last breath. A knife or a sharp object was used, and they had both been stabbed multiple times. Adrian and Leslie both had defensive wounds. One comment that multiple authorities made who had a lot of experience at crime scenes said that they could never forget the smell of this house. And I know that that can sound morbid, and this case is heartbreaking, but that metallic smell of blood was so distinctive and so poignant that it was written about many times and noted, and there was a reason for this. The house was only about 1,200 square feet. It was small. I've said that a few times now. And the lead detective, Todd Schulman, likened it to a dollhouse, which I just remembered. Another similarity in the Koberger case. There was a replica of the Moscow, Idaho house, and I think the defense team called that a dollhouse, and that was offensive to the victims. So the judge ordered them not to call it that. But this house on Dorset Street had very small rooms. I already told you. Adrian's room was about 9 by 11 feet. In such a compact space, this smell is a lot to take in. With the way that the blood had been smeared and dropped, you could almost recreate all the action that happened in there. And that's what these detectives were doing. Bloodhounds were even called out, and they took blood from that room on samples, and they brought these dogs outside. The dogs tracked to Highway 29, which would have been an easy getaway route. It was only about half a mile away, so this perpetrator could have gone anywhere. And there were no witnesses. Nobody heard or saw anything in the neighborhood except for, of course, Lauren, who was inside the house. The killer didn't leave anything behind on the road or anywhere inside the neighborhood. They canvassed the entire thing. However, forensic analyst Miss Lipsey located something that she thought was significant in the backyard. A broken cigarette. Not the butt or the filter, but the part where the tobacco is. This seemed significant because of the way it was broken. Now, most of us know that DNA can be collected from the butt, so she's keeping an eye out. She didn't know if this was from a resident at the Dorset house or not, so she collected it just in case. Then she went around the perimeter of the house, and that's when she found 2 matching cigarette butts smoked all the way down to the filters, and they were both located together in the gutter in front of the house. Now, this seems very significant, almost like somebody was casing this place, just standing around, looking at the house, smoking cigarettes out front, and perhaps they tried to jump the fence. Remember, the light went on, the motion detecting light, and maybe that's when they broke one of their cigarettes, leaving that part behind. It's plausible, and it seemed like a clue, and everything was bagged for DNA. There was so much to this crime scene that the bodies were not even removed and taken for autopsies until Tuesday. But let me get into some of that now. I'll let you know, and I already told you, that both died from multiple stab wounds. Now, I was only able to get extensive autopsy reports for Leslie's injuries. I don't know why Adrian's were not released the same way, but I was able to actually see a document that revealed everywhere that Leslie had been wounded in detail. So I am going to go over that. I think it'll give you an idea of how this attack occurred. If you think about where the wounds are located on her body, she had most of her wounds on the left side. There was a wound on the left side of her neck, 3 more above her left breast, probably as she was waking up and sitting up because her bed was positioned in a way where the left side of her body would have been facing the door. So as she sat up, probably after she heard somebody in her room, or maybe her attacker put their hand over her mouth, we don't know. But as she sat up, she most likely was stabbed at that point. She had stabs to her left bicep, the right side of her chest, at least 3 wounds to the left side of her abdomen, on both sides of her stomach, 4 in her upper back, 1 in the back of her left arm. There was another one on her left thigh, and a number of defensive wounds all over her hands and forearms. But the most tragic and severe injury was a stab right through Leslie's heart. And this meant that she bled out very quickly, and unfortunately, there would have been no way to save her. This doesn't just show overkill, it shows a crime of rage. And right away, the fact that she is a former beauty queen, very social, does a social job, dates various men, is out every week getting to know new people. And the fact that there were zip ties brought to that scene. The killer went right to Leslie's room, almost knowing exactly where it was, seemed to point to her being the target. As for Adrian, it seemed like she was awoken when the commotion happened. Even though that is speculative, Lauren saw a light go on in Adrian's room, and then she heard her scream. So that tends to lean to her hearing Leslie being attacked and screaming, and the killer was blocking them both in, so they couldn't run away. Adrian had multiple stab wounds as well, and it was referred to as a very vicious and brutal attack. But I don't have the specific areas on her body like I do with Leslie. However, she also had, like I said, defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, and even cuts between her fingers as she tried to grab for the knife. There was also a gash to her face and her neck. With what we know about Leslie's injuries, we can infer that Adrian's injuries were just as bad. But as far as the reports are concerned, I read that Leslie's injuries were more severe and there were more of them. This is in no way to diminish what happened to Adrian at all, but that is the information I was able to gather. Adrian was athletic. She played sports. She worked out at the gym regularly with her best friend Lily, so she was definitely someone to put up a fight. And she was still alive when Lauren ran up to see both of her roommates lying in that bedroom. Unfortunately, there was just way too many wounds to her body and to Leslie's for them to survive. They both died of multiple stab wounds, and the manner of death was homicide. At this point, both victims are officially identified. Their names were going to be released to the media, but this is where things get crazier. First, it was the fact that a double homicide happened on Halloween night. But then knowing that a former beauty queen, a Southern belle that came out to California recently to live out her dream had been brutally murdered, it was like Adrian went into the shadows and everything revolved around Leslie. Immediately, all the news outlets were looking for family and friends of Leslie so they could find out as much information as possible about this beautiful, stunning model who was killed in this home and possibly targeted and had been stabbed multiple times. It just made for really gripping headlines. But of course, they wanted to locate Adrian and Leslie's family members first. That was very important, but it wasn't going to be easy. Adrian's mother was on vacation out in Australia visiting her youngest daughter, Allison, who lived out there. And Arlene had a different last name than Adrian. She's Arlene Allen, and the same was with Leslie's mom, Kathy Harrington. So there was Arlene, vacationing with her two friends, planning to meet up with her younger daughter later that week. She gets back to her hotel room, and she gets a note that her daughter Lexi and her other daughter Allison had both reached out to her and left messages, and that was not good. She could understand maybe why Allison would get in touch, but not both. So the first thing she thought was maybe something happened to her parents. She called Allison because they're both in Australia, and of course, she had no idea what she was going to hear. And Allison got straight to the point. When Arlene said, "Hi, I just received your message. What's going on?" Allison said, "Mom, an intruder broke into Adrian's house, and Adrian and Leslie are dead." I don't blame her for being so blunt, but I cannot imagine as a mother getting that message. But there really is no right way to tell someone that their child has been killed. And poor Adrian, she's sitting there. She repeats it out loud. Her friends that she's staying with are right there. What a moment of shock when out of her mouth she does say, "Adrian's dead?" If one of my friends said that out loud in the moment, I don't know what I would have done. I would have broken down. And that's what happened in that room. Arlene really just couldn't even wrap her head around what she was hearing, and I don't blame her for not being able to comprehend. She kept saying it. "She's dead? She's dead?" And Allison repeated, "Yes, Adrian is dead." And once it hit her, Arlene fell apart. She was screaming. Her friends were, of course, trying to run over and comfort her, but they were also crying, and it was a mess. It was just such a heartbreaking and devastating moment, as I'm sure any of you can imagine. And at that point, she couldn't get to her daughter fast enough. You want to hold them one last time. And Arlene had no idea what happened or what was going on at this point. And that makes you feel so helpless. She was so far away, not being able to be there for your child when that is a parent's job. Allison and Arlene got to the United States as fast as they could to meet with Adrian's other sister, Lexi, and then it was straight to the police station. And that was Wednesday. Of course, they were a grieving family, but I say this all the time. They also need as much information as possible. So, of course, they have to sit down with police. Time is of the essence. They're trying to figure out what direction they should go in. But the thing is, Arlene cannot think of one person in Adrian's life who would ever want to hurt her. So her mind immediately shifted to Leslie, the newest girl of the group, the one who was really social, and the other person who had been murdered that night. So Arlene tells police that she truly believes that somebody that Leslie let into her life had intentions to harm her, and that her daughter Adrian tried to help Leslie, and that's why she was killed. She knew that's the type of person Adrian was. She would put up a fight and help someone in need. Now, when it came to informing Leslie's family that she had been killed, it was even harder. She was not a local. Nobody there really knew anything about her. All of her connections were in South Carolina. And I know you might be thinking, why couldn't they just ask someone like Lauren, the survivor? Well, she was grieving. She was a wreck. We don't know what Lauren was dealing with in those moments. But the way that Leslie's mom found out that her daughter had been killed was really heartbreaking to me. Leslie's aunt had heard from a friend that the news was reporting 2 girls got murdered on Dorset Street. And she knew that was the same name of the street that Leslie lived on. And can you imagine hearing that? How fast your heart would be beating? Kathy was driving, by the way. So just the thought that your child might be dead. And when she got home, she immediately called the local police and she introduced herself and said, "I'm Leslie Mazzara's mother, Kathy." And they were like, "We've been waiting for you to get in touch." Right then she knew. But the wait actually wasn't over yet, because they had to have a detective call her back. So for an hour, she was trying to look at the news for information. And as soon as she saw that there was one survivor, she was praying that that was her daughter. But we know that it wasn't. The detective finally did talk to her. And I understand they have to be blunt. It's probably better to just say it right away. But they just let her know that her daughter was killed with the other roommate in the house, and they were very sorry for her loss. And I understand, but at the same time, like, oh my God, that is just so cut and dry, like they're just writing a report. Like you're delivering any old message to someone. Kathy, just like Arlene, hurried to fly out to California, and she called it her worst nightmare. And by this time, Detective Schulman was interviewing Lauren in depth. They wanted to know every single detail from that night. They even went over her 911 call, which was now kind of being scrutinized. I read through it. I can see why it looks a little bit suspicious, but there were a lot of rumors swirling. Also reminded me, hate to keep saying it, of the Idaho case. So I guess there's one more similarity that I forgot to mention. Remember, there was a surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, in that case, and everyone started talking about how she could be involved and saying these terrible things about this poor girl who went through such a tragic ordeal. She could have died that night. Well, the same was happening to Lauren. They were asking, why did she escape? How was it that she doesn't have one stab wound on her? Nothing happened to Lauren. Well, the detectives thought that perhaps the killer didn't even know that Lauren's room existed, or he knew exactly where he wanted to go, and he was targeting one or both of the other females in the house. But since the police were not releasing much information, the residents and the media were having a field day with theories. There were some people in the neighborhood who wanted Lauren arrested. They wanted her to become a suspect. They wanted to make sure that she had been entirely ruled out by police. There were rumors that she was jealous of the other roommates, that she might be a lesbian and liked one of them and the other one was dating her. I mean, you name it, they were saying it. And to be fair, there were some people saying, if Lauren was a guy, she would be the number one prime suspect. But she wasn't a guy. However, it was true. The 911 call was questionable. Personally, I don't think we can blame someone for wanting to get into their car, physically leave a house where they just saw two of their friends dead. She was terrified. She relayed to the dispatcher, oh my God, they're dying. I don't know what's going on. There's blood everywhere and my roommate is gurgling. She also said that she didn't know what to do and she got in her car and left, that she just saw the perpetrator jumping out of the window. And she explained she was downstairs sleeping and they were upstairs. And all of a sudden she heard her roommate starting to scream and the dispatcher doesn't have all the information. She's kind of asking her random questions like, who's bleeding? She's like, I don't know. My roommate. I don't know if one's alive or if they're both in there. It was a very frantic moment for Lauren. You have to take in your surroundings within seconds. But the dispatcher was a little shocked that Lauren left her friends, especially since she said one was still alive. But she explained, I'm sorry. I did not want to sit around there. And finally, the dispatcher was like, okay, you don't need to go back inside, but you do need to pull over towards the house and wait for officers. And she did. I think the confusing part was that when she was asked what she saw, she said, I didn't see anybody. But then she told the dispatcher she thought the killer was on foot. So the dispatcher was like, wait a minute. I thought you said you didn't see anyone. She's like, well, the window was open. I saw a guy jumping out. So that's when the dispatcher was like, I asked you if you saw somebody. You said no. And Lauren explained, what I'm saying is, I can't tell you if it's a guy or a girl. It was a figure running down the stairs and jumping out the front window. But Lauren was thoroughly interviewed. It was in the very early morning hours of November 1st, right after those officers arrived. She was devastated. She was in shock. She just lost two of her friends. But everyone was asking the same question. If she could think of anyone who would want to hurt either of these women. And her mind did naturally go to the fact that Leslie had been dating around and bringing guys to their house. They even got into an argument about that same fact. But actually, Lauren mentioned that Adrian was the one that was dating Christian, who lived only a block away, and that they fought a lot. Well, that piqued detectives' interest immediately. And by 7 a.m., they were banging on Christian's door. He still lived at home with his parents. And when directed to his bedroom, with no information given other than they were looking for him, 9 officers were banging and telling him to get up and get outside. Christian answered the door. He'd just been awoken. Police are standing there. He's shocked. They ask him about weapons. He points to a knife in the corner. It's collecting dust. It's not anything that's been used or covered in blood, but they collect it. And then they collect his clothing and bed sheets. And he's completely cooperative. He wants to know right away what is going on. But they don't give him much information. All they say is, "Do you know Adrian?" And he says, "Yes, why?" They let him know that somebody broke into their house the night before, and they're looking for information. And of course, the first thing he asks is everyone okay? The officer said there has been some injuries. But again, they were very vague. Christian starts getting really concerned. He's like, "Where's my girlfriend? Did somebody attack her? Can I speak to her? Was she violated?" He used the R word that YouTube does not like, but he wanted to know, what kind of injuries are we talking about? He was asking a million questions. And I already told you, with these kind of notifications, they're blunt. They finally let Christian know that his girlfriend was dead. He was hysterically crying. Totally reasonable response, hearing that someone you love is no longer alive. He was interviewed for a good 3 hours, and he broke down everything: how he met Adrian, the last time that he had seen her. He was also honest with the police. He told them, "We did not have a perfect relationship. We had our arguments. We were on and off," and that he wasn't ready to commit, and that her friends thought she could do much better than him. It was well known that they had some toxicity going on. But of course, he swore he did not hurt her. He did say that Adrian tried to make him jealous, or that's what it seemed like. She would go out on their off times and rub it in his face that she met other guys, maybe trying to get him to step it up in their relationship. He tells them that the last time he saw Adrian was on Halloween, but the day before they also hung out, and they had such a nice time together. She had texted him that she missed him while he was at work. He's a bartender. He had plans afterward when he got off at 4 a.m., but instead he dropped everything he was doing and he drove over and hung out with Adrian at his house. He said they cuddled, they watched a movie, and they stayed up all night just talking and being close. And they didn't go to sleep until late morning, around 8 a.m. on Halloween morning. Later that same day, Halloween night, around 9:30 p.m., Adrian walked over to his house just to say hello. He said she stayed for about an hour, and the last time she texted him was later that night, when she told him she wished that every day they spent together could be like the last one they just had. That's really sad, but he swore he was never violent with her. They had plans for the future. She was his best friend. After this, he consents to providing a blood sample and fingerprints. They take notes on his timeline, and they also get his alibi. By Wednesday, the police had confirmed, though, that the DNA they collected from the blinds and the outside of the house was from the killer, and that he was a male. And I really do think that that's to be expected, with both what Lauren had described, the zip ties being there, plus the strength it would take to hurt 2 women. Most of the blood belonged to Leslie and Adrian, but the killer had indeed been injured and left his DNA behind. This was crucial, not just to find the killer, but to alert the public. So a press conference was set up telling the public and the residents in town to be on the lookout for someone with maybe unusual cuts on their hands or their body, a fresh open wound that could not be explained. But there was a problem. Right away, the DNA was run through CODIS. And even though this is a database of 4 million offenders, there was no match for the killer's DNA in the system. This led to another theory, that this was a serial killer who came into town with a simple motive, just to kill. And maybe the house was targeted. Maybe he was waiting. He came through town. He saw the 2 women at that house alone, handing out candy, and he took the opportunity and he just left town. Maybe they would never find him. However, there's one good thing. The DNA from the blood outside matched the DNA from the skin cells that were taken from the zip ties on the rubber band. That's a very porous material. So most likely the killer's sweat got on there and it matched the DNA from the cigarette butts. So this was a connection. To detectives, this meant the killer had been standing outside watching the house from the street, perhaps had jumped that fence, broken one of their cigarettes that fell to the ground, tried the sliding glass door, it was locked. So he went back to the front to try the window. It still didn't give them a who, but as the word spread and more people connected to the victims found out about this heartbreaking news, they were all thinking hard about who could want to harm them. Leslie's friends, Vanessa and Katie, who were just in town visiting about 2 weeks before this, they'd gone out with her, and she'd been talking to a guy at a bar. She was also there with a guy she was seeing, and he wasn't happy. So, of course, friends gave detectives that name. They were making a list of men that they needed to get DNA samples from, and that was their mission. They were going to swab as many cheeks as possible and match the DNA. A DNA sweep. Detectives were pulling all the phone records from the women in the house and looking at who they were speaking to last. And Leslie's friends from back home were also doing their own research, and they pinpoint one person that they had always had a bad feeling about. So did Leslie. I mentioned him in the beginning. He was the most recent long-term ex-boyfriend's dad. Remember him? Lee Sr., the lawyer, the one that made Leslie uncomfortable? Well, his apparent obsession wasn't in the past. Leslie had confided in her friends that he was calling her on a regular basis, not leaving her alone, and she was too nice to say anything. Who does that? He seemed like a creepy old man, a creepy old married man who was also the father of her ex-boyfriend that wouldn't take no for an answer. Plus, detectives looked. Sure enough, he had been talking to Leslie on Halloween night. When her friends found out, they thought that was too much of a coincidence. He called her not once, but twice that night. So that information gave Leslie's friends chills. It was their first lead, but he lived all the way in South Carolina. Detectives decided to pay him a visit. And of course, he was not going to do a full interview. He was an attorney after all, so he had the right to remain silent. I mean, all of us do. But he did agree to give them his DNA, which did not match the DNA found at the scene. And he said, you know what? It's just a very unfortunate coincidence that I called Leslie that night, but he had nothing to do with what happened to her, and he didn't have ill intent, according to him. He was ruled out. And one by one, they ruled men out. A handyman that had been there on Halloween, guys that Leslie had been seeing, and still, there were even more theories to explore, like the supposed Italian connection, because all three roommates had Italian last names. So some people speculated maybe it was a mob hit from Leslie working at the Coppola winery. Well, that didn't go anywhere. The whole place was interviewed, and everyone was heartbroken at Leslie's passing, so that was another dead end. Then suspicions turned to Leslie's own father, Lenny Mazzara. Now, this man was actually serving 2 consecutive life sentences in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. This happened back in the 80s. He had been incarcerated since Leslie was only 2 years old. Until this day, he had maintained that he was innocent, but the fact was that her dad was in prison for a violent crime. So it really did seem like there could be some kind of connection there. Did someone maybe have a vendetta? Well, it was looked into. Poor Leslie didn't even know her father until she was about 20 years old. And she had gone to see him over the years a few times before she moved to California because he was in Florida. But she had not seen him or written to him since. And he was torn apart when he got the news that she had been murdered. They found no connections to her killing, but at least they were being thorough. Neighbors were even telling police how they were terrified since their children had gone to that house for trick-or-treating on Halloween. One woman who lived right next door said she was traumatized and now she wanted to move out of that neighborhood. Others recalled how the roommates had gone out of their way to make these special little treat bags that were given out to all the kids that came to their door. Another resident said she brought her 2-year-old there and saw the girls in sweatshirts and jeans just having a good time, laughing and handing out candy. Everything was normal. Then she added, their home is laid out like ours, where you have to walk through the house to get to the stairwell. Whoever did this, it seems, would have had to be very intent. That's what this neighbor said. And the police knew that they had to connect someone to this crime, and fast. They were talking to more friends, and this time on Adrian's side. Her best friend Lily was shocked and devastated over losing her friend. When she got word that her best friend had died, she thought it must have been something like a traffic accident, but not murder. That never crossed her mind. But when they told her it's much, much worse than an accident, the details were so horrifying. And all she wanted was justice. She said that knowing who did this wasn't going to change much for them because they'd already lost their friends. There was no bringing them back, but it was important. And she was angry. She couldn't understand how anyone could do something like this. But another part of her, she admitted, was afraid to have a face and a name to put all of the blame on because that made it more real. It's true, because you would know the face of a monster. But Lily turned her anger and sadness into action, trying, just like everyone else, to help figure out who the killer was. She helped detectives put together what Adrian's week looked like before she was killed. Whether she said anything that sounded like a deviation in plans, who she trusted with things like maybe a house key, or who was familiar with the layout of her home or who her roommates were, and whether her car ever stayed anywhere overnight, other than her house or maybe Christian's. It was a lot, and this woman was grieving, but she answered all of their questions, and she had one of her own, one that made her feel guilty. She wondered if she hadn't deviated from her plans, if Adrian would still be alive. And that's because she, just like her best friend, still hadn't been sure if the man in her life was the one. She had broken off her engagement to Eric back in March. Why that mattered was because had she not gotten cold feet and gone through with their wedding, it was originally scheduled for November 1st. Adrian was going to be a bridesmaid, and she would have been in Hawaii that night, the night she was killed. It was just terrible irony, but I could see how a best friend could feel really bad about the decision. But she couldn't dwell on that. Soon, it was time to lay both Adrian and Leslie to rest. Another heartbreaking moment for everyone in their lives. It had only been a week. Everything was still so fresh, and their killer was still on the loose. Tuesday, November 9th, Adrian Insomnia was laid to rest in Calistoga, California, and there was a viewing from her casket before the burial. Lily was there. She looked at her friend, not the way that she usually looked, especially wearing a turtleneck, and Lily said that Adrian hated turtlenecks, just absolutely hated them, would never wear one, but that she obviously had to, and I think we know why. Lily noticed things like a lot of bruising on Adrian, and it looked to her like she had fought really hard. There were a lot of cuts on her hands, which couldn't even be covered up with makeup. Lily was completely distraught. She was crying. She had to be held up by friends, and many took to the podium in the chapel to speak, but not Arlene, Adrian's mom. She was too broken. The same day, another mother, Leslie's, was actually picking out her daughter's final outfit. I can't even imagine. I just cannot. Kathy was purposeful. She remembered her daughter's own words, that you should always have a navy blue suit. So that is what Kathy bought. And that did make me really sad. When I was reading a book about this case, Kathy also mentioned how the salesperson didn't know that she was buying the last outfit her daughter would ever wear. So there she was telling Kathy to hold on to the receipt in case she needed to exchange it or return it. And that was just another blow. And I think it's a moment that we don't know happens in these cases. We don't think about them. But Leslie was laid to rest in a mausoleum back in her hometown of Anderson, South Carolina, where over 300 of her friends and family members came to say their goodbyes. Her mom said she was so grateful that she got to be Leslie's mother for 26 years and that it was truly a gift. By the next week, the community had come together to raise $100,000 for reward for any information that would lead to the killer's arrest. And that's huge. 10,000, 20,000, I've even seen 50, but 100,000 was extraordinary. And these were donations, and they came in just one day. But truth be told, this was a very touristy area, and that's how they sustained their community there. And they needed the killer to be caught because it was bad for business. So a lot of this money came from local businesses, but nevertheless, it was an incentive for someone to talk. But no one did. There just weren't any real leads. Now, Lily and a few of Leslie and Adrian's friends set up a candlelight vigil on November 14th to raise even more awareness and to remember these two young women, and about 100 people came out that night. Lily spoke out. She was hoping that someone would come forward, and she said to the crowd, somebody must have seen something. Somebody out there knows something, because this kind of thing can't happen. Somebody would have to notice a friend of theirs acting strange or have bruises or something. It's a violent crime. It doesn't seem like somebody could walk away from it and be fine. She said that she hoped Adrian had fought so hard that she hurt the killer. She wanted the public to say something if they saw something. What no one knew was that the detectives suspected the killer's right hand had been cut. And that's because it was the right side of the stairwell wall that was marked with his blood, something that was not released to the public, a right handprint. So he most likely was right-handed. Someone needed to be looking at their male friends or acquaintances and looking at their right hands. But still, there were no breaks in this case. But that didn't stop the media from running with their stories. Leslie's mother was quoted saying that the media's intrusion was horrible. The coverage of Leslie's story was sensational, vulgar, and diminished her in every way. Those are her words. Just a former beauty queen. That's what she was reduced to. The pretty girl. I guess it sounded more compelling than describing Adrian, who was the assistant engineer at the sanitation department. It just didn't have the same appeal. This is exactly why I do try my best to talk about the victims, to honor their lives, and I try to tell you everything that I can find about who they were. Someone left a comment recently that said that my videos are just long eulogies where I make victims look perfect. I disagree. It's not the time or the place, in my opinion, to pick apart a deceased person's flaws. But where appropriate, I do talk about imperfect victims. We're all flawed. But I think a murder victim has suffered enough, and that the least we can do is honor their memory with the best moments of their life and not the darkest. Leslie's mom also said that the worst part of not knowing exactly what happened to her daughter in those last moments is that she made them up in her mind, imagining her suffering. And her therapist even told her that Leslie only died one time, but that Kathy was reliving it again and again. But unlike Adrian's mother and the police, Leslie's mom did not think that her daughter was the target. And I mean, that's probably a very hard thing to think about. It's almost like her daughter was the reason that someone else was dead type of thing. But she said that it was just as likely that someone was interested or obsessed with Adrian. Time was ticking by, and shifting blame or targets wasn't going to solve this case. The holiday season came and went, and so did what would have been Adrian's 27th birthday. It was really hard not having a killer behind bars. But then there was some positive news, something that kind of paused everyone's grief for just a moment. A wedding announcement. Since Adrian's murder, Lily had done a lot of thinking. She was reevaluating what was important in her life. And she and Eric had been through this tragedy together, and their relationship had grown a lot stronger. They leaned on one another. Eric consoled her, he comforted her, and he stood by her side in her darkest moments of grieving for her best friend. So the couple finally decided it was time to make it official. The invitations went out for their February wedding at a local Episcopal church. Eric was deeply religious. He had been since childhood, and Lily would even read scriptures with him on some of their first hangouts back in high school. So it was fitting. But what Lily was trying hard to fit in was a way to make things special for Adrian. And she thought about Adrian's mom, Arlene. She really wanted to include her in their wedding in a place where her daughter would have been if she had not lost her life. She was Lily's best friend, and Arlene was honored. She'd grown really close to Lily and Eric since Adrian's passing, and she adored both of them. Even from the very first time she met Lily, she loved her. So when the big day came, Arlene not only gave her blessing to both of them, but she spoke from the Song of Solomon, 8 verse 6, quoting from scripture. She said, "Love is stronger than death," which seems fitting. Everyone was happy, but it was bittersweet that Adrian couldn't be there to see her best friend celebrate such a big milestone. By now, friends were actually desperate for answers, especially Lauren, the survivor. She was terrified. She had been living at home with her parents, but she was still in town. She thought, what if the killer wasn't done? What if he was going to come back for her? She was freaked out. She was stressed. She was calling the detectives every single day for updates in this case. Had anyone been caught? Did they have any new suspects? And to help Lauren any way they could, her friends decided they were going to try to take action in their own way. They knew that there were some psychics out in Los Angeles who supposedly could talk to the dead. And I know what you're already thinking. Maybe you're a skeptic, and that is okay. But they were out of options, so they figured, why not? But these weren't just psychics. They were a married couple, Marty and Michael Perry, and they were both mediums. Michael believed that he could channel the deceased, and he actually called it conscious possession. And his wife, Marty, would sketch what she would see or hear during these readings, what she would perceive that the spirits were telling her. That's what she would draw on paper. They knew nothing about Adrian and Leslie. They were not told any details about the murder, nothing. This session was audio recorded, and I have to say, it's creepy. I have some clips of it that I'm going to play for you, and whether you're a believer or not, I would say it's still interesting. I'm including it in this video because this is a Halloween deep dive, but also because I do think it's important with everything that happens later. So is it going to turn you into thinking that some people can communicate with the dead? I don't know. I'm not trying to convince you of that. But immediately, when Michael is doing the session, he says that he can see two people, and one of them is loud. They're coming through very confidently, and he's getting the letter A. Well, Lauren was like, oh my God, that's Adrian. The spirit was taking the lead, and she was telling Michael that there was a party and that their lives were taken.
I have two people here. One says my first name is A. She took that party. They said their life was taken.
At this point, Michael says that he can actually feel stabs to his neck. And then he says that both the spirits are telling him murder. They're saying the word murder.
And I can feel stabs up here around my neck, or my neck's cut. Murder. They're saying murder.
After that point, Lauren was completely convinced that they were the real deal. And now she wants to set up yet another reading, but this one she wanted to focus on something in detail to possibly find the killer. So she goes ahead and consults with Detective Primo, and he gives her the go-ahead. Lauren shares more with the mediums, telling them that she hopes that they can ask Leslie and Adrian who killed them. Now, this next reading was more intense. Lauren and Detective Primo are together while Michael and his wife are in LA on the phone. He says that Adrian was taking the lead once again, speaking with Michael, and she had a message for Lauren. She wanted her to know that if she had stayed in that house, she would be dead too. I mean, that's pretty powerful, but I was thinking, like, could they have read the newspaper? I mean, I don't know what kind of details they had. I'm not trying to be, judgmental at all, but if I was a grieving survivor like that, I don't know how I would feel. But then Michael revealed something else, something that was actually never released to the media or anyone, not even Lauren. He said that now he was envisioning himself being at the scene of the crime, and he sees the first responders going in the house, and there's a female officer who goes inside and gets physically ill. She threw up at the sight of the victims. Lauren didn't know, so she's looking over at Detective Primo, and he nodded yes, confirming that that really happened. So I guess that's a lot, right? Maybe they were getting visions. There's something that happens to Marty when she's in the middle of one of these sessions. If someone that she's envisioning or getting an image of happens to have facial hair, if they're a man, her face will start itching where the hair is. And in this case, her face started itching right near her upper lip and her chin, and she knew that the killer had a goatee. When everything was said and done, here is the image, if you're watching, that she turned over to detectives. It was a Caucasian male with light eyes and a goatee. He maybe looked like he could have been in his 30s. He didn't look like he had much hair, or maybe it was very light. To me, it looked like it was receding. But when Lauren saw this picture, she didn't think she knew this man at all. But she still thought that something about him seemed familiar, but she just couldn't put her finger on it. But I also want to say that sometimes our brains want so badly to connect the dots that they make us think that there's a connection. But by this time, the police get assistance from the state police and also the FBI. And they conducted more than 1,300 interviews, and they had collected at least 218 DNA samples from men who were in contact with any of the roommates, whether in the present or the past. And Leslie's case meant that they had to go to different states and many different ex-boyfriends, some of which even came to her funeral. But her mother never thought it was anyone that Leslie had dated, because Leslie was so sweet that even after she would break it off with someone, she would still talk to them. She would keep them in her life. She would never cruelly reject anyone. They not only got samples, but they also extensively interviewed many of these men throughout Leslie's past. And there was a common theme. And it wasn't wanting to hurt her. They all still loved her. She was the one that got away. And by summer, it was Leslie's turn to forever be only 26 years old. Her birthday on August 1st went by without her there to blow out her candles or make a wish. And that was tough, especially on her brothers, who were getting more and more impatient with the lack of information in this investigation. Her best friend Kelly, on the other hand, was almost a part of the investigation because she struck a deal with the show 48 Hours, and she was about to step inside the home where Leslie had been killed. She had been struggling. And perhaps maybe she thought that this would bring her some kind of closure because she kept trying to put the murder out of her mind, but it was nearly impossible. She kept imagining Leslie suffering in pain, and it was just an unshakable feeling having a friend who you were imagining dying this way. But luckily, she had an acquaintance that worked in the medical examiner's office, and they wanted to offer some insight into stabbings, and I thought this was very interesting. They explained that survivors who had been victims of multiple stab wounds reported that they didn't actually feel the pain of the stab wounds in the moment. Your adrenaline takes over, and it feels more like a punch. It's almost as though you feel the fist that's hitting your body and not the blade. I know that sounds really hard to believe, but your brain almost puts yourself into the zone where all of your endorphins and, like they said, adrenaline come flowing through your body. And some survivors report that they're confused by what's going on. And it's not until later, when they're at the hospital or they're more lucid and they're aware of their wounds, that they actually become painful. I really am not sure if this eased Kelly's fears of Leslie's suffering or not, but the survivors did not die. And I'm not trying to be insensitive or morbid, but it just came to my mind. We don't know what that's like. But I did look into it. And scientifically, when you do lose a lot of blood, you start to get woozy and dizzy and weak until you can no longer move. You don't have the strength to open your eyes or speak or breathe. And then you pass away. It could sound peaceful, but we can't know for sure what it feels like. Kelly stepping into the place where Leslie took her last breath was emotional, to say the very least, but that's exactly what the producers of this show wanted. They wanted pure, raw emotion so Kelly could tell Leslie's story. The psychics even visited the house with Detective Primo. They walked into every room, and it was shocking. They were able to pinpoint the exact location where the girls died, as well as where very important blood evidence from the killer had been found. I had never heard of psychics being this spot on before in a case, so I'm sure that's why it was reported. But Michael, the medium, told Detective Primo that the killer was someone the victims knew, which is what they already believed. But who? It felt like they'd gone through everyone. And it was starting to get closer to the 1-year anniversary of the murders and to Halloween. And it seemed more frightening than ever. Everyone was on edge. What if the killer was waiting and he was about to strike again? There was a new police chief, Rich Melton, who decided they needed to comb through all of the evidence again, go beyond the norm, expand their analysis, and that is when a company called DNA Print Genomics came into play. They had new technology. Was it 100% accurate? No. But could it provide more details about the killer through a more extensive technique? Yes. So it was worth a try. This method broke down the killer's ancestry. They knew he was most likely of Northwestern European descent. He wasn't Hispanic, he wasn't Black or Asian, so he was a white male. And his gene markers predicted that he would have either blue or green eyes and lighter colored hair. That was more than they had before. But they didn't want to release it to the public just yet because they were looking into something else to build a better profile. They went back to those cigarette butts. These cigarette butts did not have names on them, but they did have a unique characteristic: tiny gold symbols around the filter. So they began reaching out to manufacturers, and finally they connected the brand to Camel Cigarette Company. Those particular cigarettes were a newer release called Camel Turkish Gold. They had only hit the market in California about 1.5 years ago, and most stores in that area of Northern California didn't even carry them. And the ones that did told the investigators they only sold about 1 or 2 packs a week, if that. This seemed like another lead. Most of us know about brand loyalty, but for a smoker, if they like a certain flavor of cigarette and they find a brand that they like, they rarely switch. No one in that house smoked. They already knew that these were the killer cigarettes. Someone close to the killer was bound to know that they were loyal to this particular brand and product line, right? So this is when the detectives decide to go public. On September 22nd of 2005, they release everything that they've got. That they believe the killer is right-hand dominant, he's a white male with light eyes, either blue or green, that he was close to the victims in some way, and he smoked. But not just any kind of cigarettes. Camel Turkish Gold. Now it was just a waiting game. All the ex and current boyfriends in the victims' lives had been cleared. But then the detectives started to think, what if one of them hired someone else to do it? And that could definitely complicate things. They thought they might be waiting a very long time for answers, but they were wrong because the killer was watching the news. He was feeling the pressure. He knew it was only a matter of time until he was caught. As a matter of fact, he knew detectives were onto him because they had called him twice. Once on September 7th and again on September 22nd, the same day the information was released to the media. He didn't want to give the government the satisfaction of sealing his fate, so he decided that he was going to take matters into his own hands, but not before he wrote letters to his family, to his brother, to his boss, and 2 different ones, one to each of his parents. He put them in the mail, and then he planned his self-exit. This man, this monster, had worked for a local engineering firm, and one of their clients was the sanitation district, where Adrian had worked for 3 years. His employer was actually one of the companies that donated to that $100,000 reward fund to help find Leslie and Adrian's killer. But he hadn't worked there since November of 2003, a year before he committed the killings. Now, he was employed at another civil engineering firm doing land surveys. He was a normal guy, or so everyone thought. Quiet, kept to himself, polite, came from a good, loving family. His father was in the military when he was growing up, so he did move a few times before they settled right there in Northern California. He was smart. He graduated from Napa's Vintage High School in 1997, and he was the exact same age as the victims, even in the same industry as Adrian. He wasn't a loner. He was actually happily married and had a beautiful, intelligent, and successful wife. He'd never been arrested. He'd never even gotten a parking ticket or a traffic offense his entire life. No one suspected he could ever hurt someone, let alone kill someone, especially people he knew. Because he did know Leslie and Adrian. He'd been to the Dorset house. He'd been inside. He'd gone to their funeral. He sat with their friends and even their family members. All the while, he was right there. So many people had looked into the eyes of a killer without knowing it. Does it scare you? I think it should, because it scares me that someone that no one would ever expect would be a monster hiding in plain sight. He was the type of guy who mowed his neighbor's lawn for them, liked to get his hands dirty building things out in his garage, which is why no one noticed the cuts on his hands from the knife that he used to kill Leslie and Adrian. It was normal for his hands to be beat up. He'd smile. He'd ask how your day was. He was also at the candlelight vigil that his actions forced into existence. I think that this hidden dichotomy is something worth studying in criminal profiling because it's that fascinating, but in a bad way. He had a dark side, though, one that would reveal itself even more when he had been drinking. And over the past couple years, he'd been drinking more than ever. He was getting older, and sure, he had a career, if you could call it that, but his life was more routine and mundane than anything else. He'd been stressing before the killings. He was a control freak. He didn't like the unknown, he liked the familiar, and his life had been comfortable until it wasn't. That's when his plan was set into motion. No, this was not a thrill kill or anything like that. It was rage, and they were right about that from the start. Halloween night for the killer began with a simple drinking game. But he was already buzzed, if not on the verge of being drunk, before he started to lose again and again. So he downed more and more alcohol. That's when he opened his mouth and started an argument, one that ultimately led him to be back at his apartment all alone, festering. He'll claim later that he was blackout drunk, but he still had the wherewithal to go into his garage, grab zip ties and a 6-inch knife, get into his car, drive about 5 minutes, park outside the Dorset house. And he stood in the front and even went into the back, watching, waiting, deciding his next move. Eventually, he goes to the front porch, and I wonder why no one saw him. No one thought this looked suspicious. It was Halloween night, and there wasn't many homes on this small street, and it was dark, but there were motion-activated lights. They came on several times as he moved around the house, yet no one noticed. But that light did alert Lauren that someone was outside. He will later admit that he did have a target. The source of his rage that night, or at least the pincushion to take out such rage, it had built up over time. And speaking of time, the date of the killing was significant. It wasn't a random night, and it wasn't chosen because it was Halloween. The women were killed after midnight. It was November 1st, and that held meaning. He knew what he was doing, but of course later he will claim insanity, that he doesn't remember much, and he'll change his story a few times as well. He'll try to pull the sympathy card and pretend that he's remorseful, but his intentions were all laid out in those letters to his loved ones. His motive was clear: revenge. Not because of rejection. He didn't want any of the women that lived in that home. They weren't objects of his desire. They were obstacles in his way, especially one of them. And now she was dead. Once he was finished inside, he left as easily as he made his way inside. He got back in his car, drove home, and burned all of his blood-soaked clothing, including his shoes, in a fire pit right behind his apartment building. And then he went on with his life like it never even happened. He became a killer that early fall morning, but for almost a year, he played the role of a loving husband, which blows my mind. But when his brother received that letter, he and his parents got together, and they immediately begged the killer not to harm himself, but instead, do the right thing. Turn yourself in. Especially his mother, Robin. She was beside herself with grief. In the letter that she received, he wrote in part, quote, "I am leaving this life because I know that the consequences of my actions must be faced, and they spell death. I will not grant the government the satisfaction of watching me die, so I will end my life in a place and manner of my own choosing. I don't consider it suicide. I consider it justice." End quote. Was he really going to do it? Probably not, because when push came to shove, he was a coward. He could play God and take the lives of 2 innocent women, but when it came to him leaving his world behind, he refused to follow through. And I'm glad, because justice comes with the truth, and that was about to come out. He would have gone to his grave without having to face that truth. This monster walked into the Napa police station on the night of September 27th. He walked right up to a deputy and admitted that he killed Adrian Insania and Leslie Mazzara. It was hard to believe, and actually detectives did think that this might be a fake confession. Sometimes people with mental health concerns can admit to crimes that they did not commit. They thought this might be the case. And many of the detectives had gone home for the day, but they came racing back to sit down with this man. Lead Detective Schulman met with the killer and his family in an interview room, and they spoke for hours, making sure that this was the real deal and that this was the killer. He had to provide information about the murders that no one else would know. But the first clue was right in his hand: a Camel Turkish Gold cigarette. During the 6 hours he was interrogated, he smoked the same brand of cigarettes that were found at the crime scene. And he explicitly confessed that he took both Leslie and Adrian's life. But here's where things get blurry. His version of the killings was not as detailed as they would have expected. Remember I told you that he would say he blacked out? and some of what he said didn't really match the evidence. The detectives had already determined from CCTV footage, Lauren's recollection, and the way the blood was distributed in that home that this killing took 4 minutes. I know. 4 minutes. That's it. It may have felt like it happened in slow motion, but it was quick. He was in and out of there with intention. But he wanted the authorities to believe that he went into that house in a drunken stupor with no real motive, climbed the stairs, fell asleep on the floor of Adrian's bedroom, where Leslie would later die, and that he woke up to Adrian punching him right in the face. So he had to defend himself. He claimed to not remember the stabbing. He didn't recall hurting either of the girls, but he admits he knows he did. He said he was just panicked when Adrian looked right at him because, of course, she recognized him. He was a friend. If anyone was panicked, it was her and Leslie. They were probably shocked and confused about why he was doing this to them. Why? That was the biggest question, and the killer wasn't disclosing that. He was acting as though he randomly found himself in this house and was faced with these 2 victims fighting him off. He called it having flashes of memory, that both of the girls came at him. Except he's the one in their home with a knife. Come on. The detectives weren't buying it. The fact that he burned his clothing when he went back home, that's evidence that he knew what he had done was wrong, and he was actively trying to destroy evidence of his crime. And the knife? Well, he apparently couldn't remember what he did with it. Well, that's convenient. By 3 o'clock that morning on September 28th, he was officially arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. And I realize that if you have not heard of this case, you probably want so badly to know, who the hell is he? Well, Arlene found out first. The detectives had called her when he was still being interrogated, but he'd given enough information that they were confident that he did it. Arlene was contacted about the arrest, and of course, she was shocked, but not as shocked as she was when they told her his name. She was like, wait, what? 26-year-old Eric Matthew Koppel. Yes, that Eric, Lily's husband, as in Adrian's best friend's man. How confusing is that part? Eric, the all-American, intelligent, normal guy in the friend group, he helped move Adrian and Lauren into the Dorset Street house. He was at their housewarming party. He went on double dates with them as couples. Adrian's mom spoke at his wedding. That Eric. The first thing Arlene wanted to know was why. And did Lily know? Arlene loved Lily and Eric. She had gotten closer to both of them since the murders, and it was sickening to think that all along, she was sitting right next to her daughter's killer. I mean, how could he do that? I just couldn't believe it. I was in shock. But what was confusing was why this man hadn't been looked into right away. He was at that house all the time. His then girlfriend was best friends and worked with Adrian. Even Eric's former employer was connected to Adrian's workplace. He was a known smoker among their friend group, and yet his DNA was never obtained. Why? There were so many questions, especially when Leslie's mom got the news. Who was this guy? She wasn't aware of him like Arlene was. She wanted to know what led him to commit such a heinous crime. What did her daughter Leslie do to deserve this? This monster even sat down with producers of the 48 Hours show while his wife cried about her best friend being murdered. It is so creepy looking back when Lily is looking into that camera and says, somebody must have seen something. Somebody out there knows something because this kind of thing can't happen. Somebody would have had to notice a friend acting strange or have bruises or something. It's a violent crime. It doesn't seem like somebody could walk away from it and be fine.
Somebody out there knows something. Somebody would have had to notice a friend of theirs acting strange or, had bruises. It doesn't seem like somebody could just walk away from it and be fine.
Well, Lily, did you? Did you notice your husband acting strange? Well, actually, she did. But it wasn't until the end, right before he confessed. And we're going to get to that because Lily won't be speaking publicly until December of 2006. So more than a year later. We'll get there. Here's what really happened that led to the murders after Halloween night. And it all had to do with Lily. Everyone who knew Eric said that as long as they had known him, which, he came there in high school, he was always Lily's puppy dog, following her around, letting her take the lead. She was his life, his purpose, the only thing in his life that he felt was a sure thing. He liked control, remember? And he felt that once Lily and Adrian became friends in 2003, his relationship felt unstable. And yes, it blew my mind that Lily and Adrian had only been friends for a freaking year. And she gets killed by her best friend's boyfriend. Eric believed that Adrian was telling Lily that she could do better, that she deserved more. But everyone who knew Adrian said she never spoke badly about Eric. That was all in his head. The truth was that he was the one making Lily reconsider because he had changed. His alcohol consumption had become an issue and Lily had enough. At one point, she wanted to move in with Adrian so that she could have some space from Eric. Maybe that would help rekindle their relationship because they were having problems. But he saw that as Adrian taking Lily away. He made such a big deal about it that Lily reconsidered. And things would get better for a while, and they eventually got engaged and planned their wedding for November 1st. The same day that Eric killed Leslie and Adrian. Yes, I told you that date was meaningful. Eric felt that Lily canceled their wedding in March because she wanted to be free to spend more time traveling and hanging out and having fun with Adrian. No, that wasn't it. But it was true that once the wedding was canceled, Lily realized that she and Adrian had already submitted vacation day requests for a couple weeks in November, which would have been for the wedding and the honeymoon in Hawaii. So the girls figured, let's not waste those days. Let's go on vacation together to Australia to see Adrian's sister. Eric was livid. Adrian was ruining everything again, when in fact, that wasn't the case. Lily was a grown woman who should have been allowed to have a best friend. She was merely trying to make a negative outcome into something positive and build memories in her 20s. But Eric saw it as betrayal. So to answer the question why, it's because of jealousy. And here's where the disgusting irony comes in. Remember that Bible verse that Adrian's mother read at Lily and Eric's wedding? The one that started with love is stronger than death. Well, the next line is jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement flame. And that proved to be true for Eric. Jealousy wasn't just as cruel as the grave, it's what led two innocent women being sent to theirs. The date of Adrian and Lily's vacation was looming. Eric was stewing. He thought if she left and she had too much time as a free woman, she may choose to leave him, and he couldn't have that. He couldn't let Adrian influence Lily. They were still on and off at this point. The wedding wasn't happening, but they were still living together, just minutes away from the Dorset Street home. On the night of Halloween, Eric and Lily went to a friend's house and they played drinking games until Eric was extremely wasted, which wasn't uncommon. And neither was him making an embarrassing comment to Lily and getting her so upset, she demanded they leave. She drove him back to their apartment, dropped him off, and left to spend the night at her parents' house. And guess what? They were out of town because they couldn't cancel their flights to Hawaii that they booked for Lily's wedding. So she was house sitting for them. Wow. Eric chose to use that time all alone to sneak into his girlfriend's best friend's home and kill her and her roommate. Sadly, it appeared as though Eric mistakenly thought that Leslie was Adrian in that first room in the dark. He entered the wrong room. He killed Leslie thinking it was his target. Yet I want to mention one other interesting piece of information that was received by the police. A friend said that Eric was infatuated with Leslie. They could tell, because there were times he would sit there mesmerized by her, just staring. And that one time Lily had to pry him away from a conversation with Leslie because she wanted to leave, but he wanted to stay and talk to her. So there are some people who believe that he may have wanted Leslie that night to, at the very least, while he was there, bind her and have his way with her before killing Adrian. We're never going to know. Other people think that maybe he probably tried to make a move on Leslie in the past. She rejected him because she was Lily's friend, and it was only a matter of time until she revealed the truth to her. So she had to go too. since nothing could come between his relationship with Lily. It didn't help that Lily had broken off their wedding the very same month in March that Eric's parents had filed for divorce. He told detectives he was extremely depressed, having ideations of exiting this world, but instead of getting help, he self-medicated with substances. At his preliminary hearing on October 15th of 2005, it was revealed that Eric's DNA matched the killer's blood at the scene, as well as the cigarette butts and the rubber band on the zip ties. The DA wanted the death penalty. And this crime qualified because of special circumstances. There was more than one victim, he was lying in wait, and it was felony murder because it happened during a burglary. Now, if you were wondering, Lily was standing by her man. But Arlene understood in some way because she had forgiven Lily. She felt terrible that Lily had also been a victim in all this. She was married to the man who killed someone she loved and that she cared about. It wasn't going to be easy going through all the judgment and the humiliation, but I just don't know if I could stand by someone, even stand by my vows of death do us part, if my husband was a murderer. But what about you? Lily would later say, and we'll get to this in more detail, but she would say that the man she married was not the same man who killed Leslie and Adrian, and that essentially he wasn't in his right mind. But he himself said he had a dark side. He said it in his letters. So was it the real him all along, hiding in the shadows, pretending to be a loving and kind husband? And I wanted to point out, not only did the psychics kind of draw a sketch that looked similar to Eric. I mean, I'm going to put them both on the screen. He did end up having a goatee, but the police were onto him. Remember how I told you they called him twice? Well, they had figured out from Lauren that the only people in their friend group that had smoked were Lily and Eric. So they were calling to interview him. He never answered. They went to his work. He didn't answer there either. They left a message. So all this to say, they were onto him, but it took a really long time. And that's what ultimately made him confess. And apparently at some point, and we don't know when, he told his wife what he had done. And he showed her a scar that was on his hand. So before he came clean in court, Lily did know. What do you think of all that? I still think they could have found him way sooner. But the bottom line is, they caught him. On December 5th of 2006, family members, friends, the public, the media, and Eric's counsel joined the judge and the district attorney in the Napa County Courthouse. They were all ready for a trial, and then it was announced that they had come to an agreement. Eric had taken a plea deal. The details were as follows. Eric pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing both Leslie and Adrian, plus he admitted to the special circumstances. He also agreed to waive his right to appeal, but he wanted life in prison instead of death. And if he ever tried to appeal, death could attach again. This plea deal was accepted by both sides, and Eric admitted in open court that he was guilty. Next was the sentencing, which was scheduled for January 11th, 2007, just a few weeks after his plea deal. Leslie's mom said by that time, she and her sons, who initially wanted to see Eric be put to death, no longer felt that way. Kathy was actually a pastor, so she had her moral and her religious convictions, and she didn't think death was just. However, her sons did not see eye to eye, but finally, they just wanted it to be over. Arlene agreed she felt for Eric's family. This woman was very compassionate. She didn't want another family to lose a child. But the victims' loved ones did get a chance to speak to their killer face to face. And I just really wanted to share some of what was said because, wow, I felt like the media did chop up a couple of things and take them out of context to make them more viral. I'll tell you which one. But Leslie's mother went first, and she told Eric she was glad that he found God if that was true, but she could never forgive him for killing Leslie. However, Leslie's best friend Amy did forgive Eric. I don't know how she had the strength. But Kelly, on the other hand, told Eric that she wanted him to rot in hell. No forgiveness given. Arlene's statement was the most powerful in my opinion. She had been so kind to Eric, and she was so angry. She said, Eric, I know you. I know that you are a man who brutally and callously took the life of a wonderful woman. You are a man who violently stabbed to death the best friend of the woman that you love. That is not love, Eric. You cannot love Lily and murder her best friend. You cannot love Lily and bring a knife into Adrian's home and stab her again and again and again and again. And she said this over 12 times as she banged her fist down on the podium. And if that's not compelling and intense, I don't know what is.
You are a man who violently stabbed to death the best friend of the woman you love. That is not love, Eric. You cannot love Lily and bring a knife into Adrian's home and stab her again and again and again and again and again.
She even mentioned how he sliced her daughter's throat, something that had not been revealed publicly. She said, "Yes, Eric, I know what you did. You are a man that's so cold, he would invite the mother of the woman that he murdered to stand up at his wedding and read scripture to him of love and death and to bless your union. I know you, Eric. You are a murderer and a coward." And after that intense speech, it was actually Lily's turn. And this is what I just wanted to point out, that the media I just want to say switched the narrative a bit. It was what was said, but it just made for a very viral moment where they made it seem like one of the first things that Lily said in court looking at Eric was, "There's nothing that you could do to make me love you any less." And of course, when you're sitting there watching the footage and that clip comes up, you're going to want to hate this woman. I mean, some of you may anyway, no matter what, because she still loved Eric. But the first thing she did, she thanked the victims' families, and it was for agreeing to the plea deal. Because she did love her husband, that was true. She also told Arlene she was very thankful of how loving and supportive that she had been towards her, even though her husband had killed her daughter. But after that, she chronicled the days that led up to Eric confessing and how she knew that something was wrong, but he wouldn't open up to her. Of course, she had no idea that he was hiding the fact he was a killer. She just wanted her husband to feel comfortable talking to her. So this is when she told the court. She was begging him to tell her what was wrong, and she told him at the time, "Eric, there is nothing in this world you can do to make me love you less."
Eric, there is nothing in this world that you could do to make me love you less.
But she explained. She understood that people were not going to comprehend why that statement was still true that day, like it was back then, meaning she still loves her husband and there really is nothing he can do to make her love him less. So she really said it, but in her mind and the way she explained it to everyone that was sitting in that courtroom was that there was nothing that ever pointed to him being able to carry out such a terrible crime. She said he was honest, he was a Christian, he was gentle and reserved, and she was shocked. She said it was just the perfect storm, her words, between their breakup, his parents getting divorced, his chronic depression, substances, alcohol. He just lost control. It felt like a slap in the face to the victims and their families. And they still had the burden of hearing this monster's appalling excuse for his disgusting actions. And I felt not 1 ounce of compassion for him. I think he was only sad because he was too dumb not to get caught and too cowardly not to do what he said he was going to do and remove himself from this planet instead of 2 innocent people before he carried out the acts. I really don't wish that on anyone. I'm just saying that's how I felt hearing him speak. And I'm sure I'm going to play some audio, hopefully. I think I can. YouTube's so weird with that stuff. But he had a lot of time to come up with what he was going to say. And instead of just being honest, talking to everyone in an easy to understand, straightforward manner, he decided to read poetry that he wrote. And to me, that was narcissistic. Like, show us how smart you are, Eric. Show us how eloquent you are with your words. Not the time or place. But here's what he said. Almost stuttering because he couldn't get the words out. He was tearing up.
Voice doesn't work.
He said, "I'm a broken man." And then since he couldn't speak, he's like, "Oh, this sucks." He's saying it under his breath. Well, yeah, it does suck. It more than sucks. But he started over, he regained his composure, and he said, "I'm a broken man, splintered by a penetrating awareness of my own potential for wickedness.
I am a broken man. Oh, it sucks. A man splintered by a penetrating awareness of my own potential for wickedness.
While I cannot fathom the full extent that my actions have caused, I recognize that my sinful deeds have inflicted terrific agony on a great number of people. The words evade me to articulate the depths of my sorrow or turmoil I created, to what extent I'm able to endeavor some of the circumstances that led up to this heinous crime. I have suffered from depression from adolescence, and I had strong suicidal tendencies from my early teenage years. I've always been a decidedly introverted person. That's his excuse? Poetry out of the lips of a killer? He went on to explain that in the months before Halloween, all these tragic things were happening in his life. His parents got divorced, his grandfather had a stroke, and then died. Financially, he wasn't doing well. He couldn't get a job that he wanted, and he thought his relationship with Lily, who he described as the singular ray of light in his otherwise black world, was in peril of collapsing. His words. He said that these were the factors that fertilized the seed of anger sown in his heart as a youth, and that Lily had pleaded with him to get help, but he refused, and he turned to self-medication that only worsened his depression. It sounds like a sorry excuse to me. No. He didn't seem remorseful, and actually what he said to the police about him blacking out and all that stuff, he said that was true, that he just wandered in there drunk, stumbled upon some dirty clothes, fell asleep, all that, and I just call BS. But the case was closed. We probably will never know what this wicked man really intended, and we don't need to know. Any reason will do, because what's done is done. He's evil. He'll spend the rest of his life where he belongs. After this, Lily did divorce him, and he decided to enter a ministry program in prison, and that path for him might be meaningful, but it doesn't fix what he did. It doesn't return these two innocent victims. And there's one more moment I need to share, because it does say something about what grief sometimes becomes after all the cameras go off. After the sentencing, when reporters were packing up, a friend leaned over towards Kathy, Leslie's mom, and she said, "Do you want to meet Eric's mother?" Kathy said she was terrified, but she said yes. And this other woman is walking towards her, just trembling. And Kathy just looked her in the face and she thought, oh my God, I am her. They even looked alike. So here's this woman who lost her daughter at the hands of this other mother's son, and she hugged her. And for a second, they were just two moms, standing in the same room, holding on to each other because they were both so broken. I don't know how she did it. I know that Kathy is a reverend. I understand that. But that would be way too hard for me. Next time Halloween rolls around, you're going to see masks everywhere. Cute ones, creepy ones, clever ones. But just remember, the mask isn't the danger. The danger is the person who never needed one. The monsters who choose to wear a human mask to hide the evil that's inside. I want to thank you truly for being here for Leslie and Adrian's story. I will see you in my very next video.